Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. It is a busy day on Capitol Hill. First, in the House, Republicans voted to remove Congresswoman Liz Cheney from leadership. She made it clear she was not backing down from the position which led to her ouster, a refusal to believe former President Trump's false claims about widespread election fraud.
I will do everything I can to ensure that the former president never again gets anywhere near the Oval Office. We have seen the danger that he continues to provoke with his language. We have seen his lack of commitment and dedication to the Constitution. And I think it's very important that we make sure whomever we elect is somebody who will be faithful to the Constitution.
Wednesday's voice vote differed from a secret ballot contest 2 months ago, which she resoundingly won. Shortly after the vote, New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik announced a formal effort to replace her. If successful, Stefanik would be the third Republican in leadership who voted against certifying President Biden's electoral victory, something that has become a defining issue for the party. Here's Kevin McCarthy earlier today.
I don't think anybody is questioning the legitimacy of the presidential election. I think that is all over with. We're sitting here with the president today. So from that point of view, I don't think that's a problem.
McCarthy was among the more than 140 Republican members of Congress who voted to overturn state election results after the Capitol insurrection. He was also one of the big four congressional leaders invited to the White House Wednesday. President Biden met with the top two leaders from the House and Senate. The White House says the goal was to find any common ground on its infrastructure and jobs proposals. But Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's continuous attacks on the effort mean areas of agreement are proving elusive. Congress is also holding more hearings on the January 6th Capitol attack. Perhaps the day's most significant testimony came from the former acting defense secretary. Christopher Miller said the decision not to deploy troops to the Capitol was all about optics. He said he did not want to fuel conspiracies of a military coup, a notion frequently stoked by former President Trump. Miller appeared to walk back comments he originally made about the former commander-in-chief's role in the violence. In written testimony submitted before the hearing, Miller said, quote, "I personally believe his comments encouraged the protesters that day." He later omitted that sentence during his actual remarks. For more, Rebecca Kaplan, Zeke Miller, and Sarah Mucha join me now. Rebecca is a CBS News Capitol Hill producer. Zeke is a CBSN political contributor and White House reporter for the Associated Press. And Sarah is a politics reporter for Axios. Welcome. It's good to have you all on this very busy day. Zeke, let me start with you. How should we understand Christopher Miller's decision to state in written testimony, but not in his oral remarks, that he believes former President Trump's comments encouraged protesters on January 6th?
And this is consistent with sort of what we've seen from a lot of Republicans and a lot of people who are allied with President Trump, the evolution that they have taken over the past 3 or 4 months since January 6th, where they've come out. Their initial position was one of shock, of horror, of condemnation for what happened, criticism of the former president himself, and then over time they've moderated in their criticism of the former president, and in some cases moved to sort of apologize for it and to shift the blame for the insurrection to others. And we heard from some Republican lawmakers today even denying what we all saw with our own eyes play out on live television 4 months ago. So I think that what we saw from the former acting secretary was a version of that happened within just 24 hours or so. It is an indication of just how much influence the former president has over Republicans, over the Republican Party broadly, even though he is out of office. And it is notable that Christopher Miller did not mention it. He did note that he had somewhat reassessed his previous criticism of the former president, learning that there had been organized groups involved in planning parts of the insurrection, and that is undoubtedly true. But even in his own testimony, the written testimony referenced the president's comments, and the fact that he was unwilling to say that publicly on camera does sort of point to sort of the cloud of Trump that still hangs over every mention of that day.
Well, Sarah, you have been tracking the response to Congresswoman Cheney's ouster from key swing state voters. What were the biggest takeaways?
That's right. In the latest focus group that Axios listened in on of swing voters. Now, these are voters who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and then changed their vote to Joe Biden in 2020. Almost every one of those voters said that ousting Liz Cheney was a mistake on the part of Kevin McCarthy and House Republicans. What's interesting is if you zoom out a little bit, those voters, almost all of them said that they would vote for a Republican in 2022. But then, whether that was for the House or the Senate, but then asked again if they would vote for a Republican who perpetuated the myth that the election was stolen. Everyone but one voter said no, they would not. I just want to make clear, too, that this is sort of still a beltway kind of drama. A handful of the voters, they only knew that Liz Cheney by name, and even fewer knew Liz Cheney had any sort of leadership position in the Republican Party. One caveat, of course, is that a group of swing voters is not necessarily a poll, and therefore it's not statistically significant, but it's still really interesting to see how these voters in these key states like Arizona and Florida and Michigan are thinking about these nationally broadcasted issues.
Yeah, no, it's a really important point on both fronts, Sarah. The idea that, number one, people out in the places far beyond the Beltway are not consuming this kind of political news in the same way that all of us are. But at the same time, it is interesting to hear from people in those key swing states. So Rebecca, I want to ask you about some behind the scenes here. New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik is going to be speaking with the Freedom Caucus Wednesday night. And we spoke yesterday about Congressman Chip Roy's letter criticizing Stefanik's voting record. So what is Congresswoman Stefanik's pitch to them?
Well, her pitch that she talked about earlier today in a letter to all of her members is presenting this unified voice on behalf of GOP leadership. There's going to be a lot of talk about the Democrats' socialist and radical agenda and stopping Joe Biden and why that's so important for the Republicans to win back the House in 2022. And really, they're only a few seats away from doing so. So that's certainly a realistic vision. It's also, one of the reasons that Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader, cited for pushing Cheney out of leadership and backing Stefanik, saying that it was a distraction. Cheney was a distraction from that goal of winning back the House, which, of course, would likely make him the next Speaker of the House. So Stefanik is promising to listen to everyone, to empower members, to push forward with an aggressive media agenda on issues that are important to the GOP, things like border security, China, pushing back against tech platforms, all of this stuff that really does appeal to the base of the party. She knows she has to win over some conservative critics in places like the Freedom Caucus. You talked about that Roy letter, and he points to her past voting record. Rightfully so. She has not always been in complete alignment with former President Trump. The most notable probably is that she voted against the 2017 GOP Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that big tax cut bill, citing the problems in her own district with the cap on the state and local tax deduction. So that's kind of been their pushback. The biggest thing helping her at the moment, frankly, is the fact that no challenger has actually emerged. Roy today was kind of flirting with the idea. He's saying he's not ruling it out, but he doesn't want this to be a coronation for Stefanik, given that no one else is running against her. You've heard that from a few other people, but no one has come forward to say, I'm going to challenge her. And Stefanik herself told reporters this afternoon that she is absolutely confident she has support from enough corners of the GOP caucus, more moderate members and more conservative members, that she will successfully be elected on Friday.
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca, I just wonder, does it even matter what one's voting record is if one has the imprimatur of the former president himself, if in fact, he is the person who is carrying the most influence over the party at this point, at least with the base? Does a voting record is it clear that that's even going to matter? Although it has in the past to the Freedom Caucus, it's a much different atmosphere now.
It has in the past, and like I said, I think it would matter more if there was someone challenging her with a more staunchly conservative voting record. But that's a great point, Elaine. That signature of approval from former President Trump means a lot in the House Republican caucus. It's interesting. We've seen a lot of actually Republican senators criticize what happened to Liz Cheney Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa even said that this was cancel culture, a favorite talking point among Republicans run amok against Cheney herself. But, with the support of the former president, his word means so much in the House GOP that is likely enough to really quiet any criticism and get her over the finish line.
Well, Zeke, while McCarthy affirmed President Biden's legitimate election victory today, a number of Republican-led states are moving to clamp down on voting access. How is the issue of election integrity defining the party?
This has emerged a couple of days after the events of January 6th as sort of a way for Republicans to try to politically thread the needle, to try to come off as, try to find a way to keep their the former president's supporters who bought into his baseless allegations about the 2020 election and his efforts to overturn the election results, keep them animated while also keeping the rest of the Republican Party that didn't buy into it and acknowledged President Joe Biden's rightful victory or legitimate victory in the election in the fold as well. It was an attempt by the Republicans to try to carve out a very narrow lane on a safe path by focusing on what had traditionally been a Republican proposal of policies like voter ID, clamping down access, concerns about election fraud more broadly. And that would be an effort when Democrats were trying to expand voting access for them to try to keep the broader big tent Republican Party together, and that big tent being those who were bought into the president's the former president's views and misstatements about the 2020 election, and those that didn't. That is a harrowing path for the Republican Party because some of the policies that they're advocating for can actually backfire for them politically. At the ballot box, like we saw in Georgia, vote by mail, and other efforts to restrict on those fronts, ultimately hurt the party. Also, it exposes them to frustrating one or the other wing of that party if they deviate too far in one direction, continuing along the lines of baseless fraud and allegations along those lines on one end could repel sort of the centrists in the Republican Party, and then not sort of embracing former President Trump's rhetoric could depress turnout among his supporters. So it's a very harrowing path for Republicans here, and one that will be a defining a defining decision for them to embrace this issue, so make it so front and center in their politics and then on their agenda going forward into 2022.
Well, Sarah, some 100 Republicans are threatening to break off into their own party. Who is leading this effort, and does this have any chance at succeeding?
That's a great question. I think I'll start with this, right? If anything, this letter is just another example of a Republican Party at war with itself. And as we've mentioned a couple times tonight, that Donald Trump has a lot of staying power. Now, the effect, right? There are no elected officials who are charging this letter. So that's something to consider with whether or not this will have any kind of sway. And I spoke recently with a Republican who signed that letter, and they were very self-aware and acknowledged sort of the wall that they're coming up against, made an interesting point saying that administrations used to rely on sort of these experts that they would keep around them. And Donald Trump, he exhibited an unconventional sort of governance and did away with a lot of the reliance on experts that other administrations may have before. And so a lot of the Republicans who signed this letter, they are those experts. Those are the people who are leading this charge. And it's hard to say whether or not elected Republican officials will feel any sort of deference to them, given that Trump's MO during his presidency was to rely on these kinds of experts less.
All right, Rebecca, in our final minute or so, what do we know about President Biden's meeting with the so-called Big Four Wednesday afternoon?
Well, this was his first chance sitting down with the top 4 members of congressional leadership. And while this had kind of the veneer of a return to normalcy after the Trump presidency, everyone coming, talking, there was no storming out, it really showed us that infrastructure is still going to be very difficult to achieve on a bipartisan basis between the White House and Congress. Everyone came out of that meeting saying there's bipartisan support for infrastructure. Everyone wants to do it. But when you listen to kind of the details, the devil's always in the details, and that is where everyone is still getting hung up. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell came to the microphones afterward and said that a red line for Senate Republicans is touching anything about the 2017 Republican tax bill. And President Joe Biden was planning on paying for this first tranche of the infrastructure funding by raising the corporate tax rate. They're saying that's a non-starter. On the other hand, Republicans are more open to things like user fees to pay for infrastructure. And you have the president and Speaker Pelosi saying that they are opposed to doing anything that's going to raise taxes on Americans making less than $400,000. And for them, something like a gas tax, that kind of traditional way of paying for infrastructure, is a tax on lower middle class Americans, so they're opposed to do that. And then, of course, there's the issue that no one agrees on what actually constitutes infrastructure. Republicans are focused on traditional roads, bridges, water projects. Democrats want to expand it and talk about the caregiving infrastructure in the United States, child care, parental leave, all of these things. So while everyone says that they're on board and it was a very nice meeting between everyone, they're still miles apart at the end of the day.
All right, we'll continue to watch it all. Rebecca Kaplan, Zeke Miller, and Sarah Mucha, great to have you all. Thank you very much.